Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. I'm Jenny Ift, and I teach agricultural policy at Kansas State University. Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. Today, I'm excited to have Ann Schechinger from the Environmental Working Group on the podcast as a part of the Conservation Agricultural Policy series we're having. Ann, welcome. Would you like to start with telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, and thanks for having me. I'm Ann Schechinger. I am the Senior Director of Agriculture and Climate Research at Environmental Working Group. I'm an agricultural economist by training. I'm from Michigan originally. I got my master's in agricultural food and natural resources at Michigan State. And then after grad school, I moved to Des Moines, Iowa, to work for Pioneer, which is now part of Corteva Agriscience. So, I've worked in nonprofits for a long time, but I actually started my career in agribusiness on the business side. But now I've been at EWG for almost 12 years. And during that time, my focus really has been on doing research and data analysis and data visualization. And of course, writing my research results as well, really to educate, our audience on the environmental, public health, and climate impacts of row crop agriculture as well as livestock-based agriculture. And of course, I also work on a federal policy and state policy, specifically when it comes to agriculture, which is why I'm on this podcast. So I've done work on conservation programs, farm subsidy programs, and then my favorite topic, which is crop insurance. And just the last thing is I also manage EWG's Midwest team, which is in the Twin Cities. And our Midwest team is super cool because we do EWG's geospatial work. So we do a lot of really cool geospatial analyses and mapping about agriculture, but also a lot of other EWG projects.
Awesome. And it seems I see your name in the media a lot separately, and I saw that you were an agricultural economist, so that's great. I'd also like you to tell us more about the Environmental Working Group. I think that the main way, or initially when I became familiar with EWG, was a payments database. EWG's values, working towards, and maybe tie in what you see as the role of government in that vision.
Yeah, so EWG is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and advocacy organization. Our mission is to empower you with breakthrough research to make informed choices and live a healthy life in a healthy environment. So our two main focuses really are on public health and environmental health. And we conduct research and publish projects on our website, really to help inform our audience about how, different sources of pollution impact their health and the environment. And of course, we do the advocacy side too, taking our research to Capitol Hill and state legislatures and talking to policymakers. But EWG is really interesting because we work on a lot of topics. So we're really well known for our research into consumer products like the Skin Deep database, our household cleaners database, and of course, our shopper's guide to pesticides and produce, which is, includes the Dirty Dozen.
Dirty Dozen.
Top
Whoever came up with that's very catchy. So.
I know we've had the name for many years, even before I started.
Have you trademarked it?
They have, I believe.
Okay.
Yes. So we do this consumer work, but then we also have, a lot of research and advocacy focused on food and agriculture, and specifically on how farm policies impact the environment, climate, and public health, which is, more of the area where I work. And I will say EWG started with agriculture 30 plus years ago, so it's still super important to the organization. We have our farm subsidy database where we collect information down to the recipient level of every farmer in the United States that gets farm subsidy payments every year. We update that yearly. We're starting to gather the data right now to update that with 2025 data. And so, along with the database in general, we do a lot of work on federal policy. I think everyone listening would know that, U.S. ag policy really helps determine what crops farmers grow, what practices they use on their farms. So, we really try to work on changing those policies essentially. And then we also, do the consumer side where we're educating consumers on how, what they buy impacts our farming system as well. And I would say, we are supportive of government involvement in ag. On the regulation side, we think it's super necessary for government to be involved in situations like permitting for large animal feeding operations. That's an EPA practice where they have NPDES permits for largest animal facilities. And then on taxpayer supportive ag, we really support giving farmers taxpayer money when the practices they are doing benefit taxpayers, right? That makes the most sense to us. So we've always supported funding for federal conservation programs because they really have proven benefits for the environment and climate and public health, which also, of course, benefits taxpayers. And then we're supportive of farm subsidies if they go to people who need the support. So, small farmers, farmers who grow crops like fruits and vegetables that are beneficial for public health. Of course, we support the SNAP program as well. But then on the other side, it's harder for us to support taxpayer funded subsidies for large farms that really don't need the money financially because, we know through our farm subsidy database and a lot of analysis that generally farm subsidies are going to these larger and wealthier farms that have a higher household income than like the average American household income. And of course, a lot of farm subsidy money goes to commodity crops like corn that have pretty, serious impacts on the environment as well as public health. So we're supportive of a lot of different government programs for farming, but then less so on some of these other farm subsidies. And I can go on and on about that topic. So happy to
Yeah.
talk more.
I mean, so you talked a lot about doing research. Is this, and you can do research in a lab. Economists, we tend to do research on our laptops using satellite data, administrative data. So that'd be like the FSA data, data, publicly available data. How and I get that you probably don't do way more than one type of research, but could you kind of summarize any sort of themes or sort of general data sources you're using?
Yeah, so we don't do a lot of lab research. It's something that we've talked about in some of our, more toxics focused work, the consumer products work. But our research really is using public data sets. And then we also, do some geospatial analysis to create data sets that don't exist publicly. So a lot of my work in the public data side is with, conservation data that's coming from USDA's NRCS. And then, of course, the farm subsidy data from the Farm Service Agency and crop insurance data from the Risk Management Agency. Those are, really huge data sets that we're able to analyze and kind of look for different things in the data. I've done a lot of work kind of looking at payments compared to like weather data as well, NOAA data in certain counties to show, like, for instance, that we're seeing, big crop insurance payments in counties that got a lot of rain, over the last 10 years in the Midwest, for example. So sometimes we'll use multiple public data sets to see what kind of connections are there. And then on the other side of us creating data sets, something that we've been doing for 10 years now is using satellite and aerial imagery along with like a peer-reviewed methodology we have that finds animal feeding operations within satellite and aerial imagery. So there's a lot of states that don't track every animal feeding operation on the landscape. So we have been tracking it ourselves.
Okay. So when I was at Cornell for a while, and I did a study looking at large dairy it's mostly the large livestock farms there tend to be large dairy. I was looking at large dairy and land values, and I think I was able to get the address for the concentrated animal feeding operations for the CAFOs, but you said animal feeding operations.
Yeah.
So, personal angle, I'm a little curious. Is it anything or just the larger ones that you're able to capture?
So we do this to capture all of them. So CAFOs, the ones with the NPDES permit are the ones that the EPA or states already have the addresses for. And so 10 years ago, when we started looking into this, we realized that those databases are not capturing the majority of the animals produced because they're just capturing the largest facilities. So we created this methodology to find AFOs that are smaller than the permitted level in states so we could better track, where are these facilities, where are they producing manure?
Yeah.
And we also are able, in some states, we've modeled where manure is likely applied on farm fields near these facilities.
Yeah, and that could be pretty, I think, sometimes the farm size takes into account the regulatory thresholds is my understanding, and there's been some research on that in the ag econ literature.
Very much so. We did this analysis in the Western Lake Erie Basin in Iowa. And I fell for it, the Iowa, Ohio thing, which people always talk about when I lived in Iowa.
So you haven't made me mad yet.
But that we did this in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, and we found, especially in Ohio, there are, a lot of hog facilities that have 2,499 hogs because you have to have 2,500 to require a NIPD's permit. So it's definitely something where people are aware of the permit level and can get just underneath it so they don't have to get an EPA permit. That's common in our data.
All right. Now let's I'd like to hear about a recent project you've been working on. You have a report on nitrates that just came out?
Yeah, so we just released a report on nitrate in drinking water, and we have looked into nitrate for many years, but this is the first time ever that we looked at nitrate levels in community water systems drinking water down to a lower level. So community water systems are like your basic water utilities where most people who are in a city or a small town get their
Yeah.
water,
Yeah.
drinking water from.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we looked at how many of those community water systems tested for nitrate down to 3 milligrams per liter between 2021 and 2023. And we found that it was over 6,000 systems nationally that tested at this level, and that affected over 62 million people who drink water from those systems. Definitely important to note that the MCL, so the maximum contaminant level that the EPA sets in drinking water for nitrate, is 10 milligrams per liter. But there's been a lot of research showing that, there's health harms like colorectal cancer and bladder cancer and birth defects in babies tied to nitrate
Yeah.
consumption at levels much lower than 10. So that's why we
Okay.
didn't just want to look at the 10.
Okay. Okay. So how do you collect data on nitrates from local waters? Is this public testing? Did you have to go out and do it yourself? Actually, it's probably too many to do it yourself. That was a bad question.
Yeah. No, it's all public data. So EWG
Okay.
has a tap water database, which you can find by, just Googling EWG tap water database. And so basically we FOIA every state to get the results of all of their public water systems, drinking water tests every year. So we're the only database outside of the EPA, which is not as the public EPA's database on drinking water data isn't as complete as ours
Okay.
because most of the data they have is, on the back end, not available to the public. So we're the only organization that has all of these tests in one place in our
Okay.
database.
So I assume every municipal water system is required to do some regular testing. What are they testing for and how often?
Yeah, so there is a whole set called the Primary Drinking Water Standards that the EPA sets that water systems have to test for. It's a bunch of contaminants. Nitrate is just one of them. And it depends on how frequently they have to test depends on the water system size. So smaller systems don't have to test as frequently for these contaminants. Bigger systems have to test, every year and even more frequently in some cases. So they test pretty regularly for all of these regulated contaminants. And then every one of the contaminants on that list has a level that water systems have to stick to.
So a lot. So I grew up in a town of near a town of 4,000 people. Would they be testing every year?
Yes, very likely.
Okay.
So 4,000 is like a medium-sized system in the
Okay.
EPA's speak. Large is
Uh-huh.
10,000 and up.
So if you had a town of 400 people, would they have to test every year?
I think it depends on their prior tests as well.
Okay.
So it depends on what they've
Okay.
found in the past, how regularly they have to
Okay.
test. But the smallest
Okay.
systems only have to test for nitrate once every 3 years, which is why we looked
Okay.
at a 3-year period specifically to
Okay.
make sure we
Okay.
captured every system that had tested for nitrate.
Wouldn't there be a need is there some seasonality in this? Like you'd want to test at different
Yeah.
times of the year?
Yeah. So nitrate is a chemical component of fertilizer and animal manure. So we see levels much more in the summer when fertilizer and manure is being applied to farm fields, or when it's applied in the spring and then it rains in the summer, you see higher levels of nitrate in water. So definitely testing in the summer is really important. But also you'll see like in Des Moines, they tested above 10 for nitrate in drinking water like this January of 2026. So even though it seems like a seasonal problem in places where there's already really high nitrate levels in soil, it can get into drinking water kind of at any time of the year.
Okay. So So these tests are happening at varying frequency depending on how big a system is, but that's done at the state level.
Yep.
By states,
Yeah.
it's environmental, whatever the state agency is called that works with
Yeah.
the EPA.
Yep.
Okay, and
Like
so
here in Minnesota, it's the Department of Health, and I think in
okay,
Iowa, it's the DNR. So it really depends on the state. But state agencies are the
okay,
ones that get the test results, and then, we
okay.
FOIA the results from all these state agencies.
Do some state but there's no legal reason the state it would be private. It's something that is FOIA'd regularly. Or is it
Yeah.
publicly reported sometimes?
So it's publicly reported by the water utilities in a PDF document every year. So water
Okay.
utilities have to do something called a consumer confidence report where they will set, and anybody can look theirs up. I like to look mine up every year just
Yeah.
for fun because I
Yeah.
know about it to see what's in my drinking water.
Okay.
But it's all like PDF data, so it's
Okay.
impossible to like get access to the level of data that we have unless you're doing a public records request.
Okay. Okay. So you can look it up in a local PDF, but you're probably not going to get it in useful format to do research unless you FOIA it. And the EPA is aggregating some of this data and making
So
it available publicly.
what they make publicly available is like the violations data. So if you go above that 10 milligrams per liter for nitrate, then it's in their database.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So I need to better understand the 3 versus 10. This is
Yeah.
completely out of my field. So what is the justification or the reason for that 10 milliliter level set by the EPA?
So 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate was set by the EPA to guard against blue baby syndrome. So they
Okay.
found in the 1960s that people who drank water with levels higher than 10 milligrams per liter, if they gave that water to babies, it could cause blue baby syndrome, which is a condition that starves babies of oxygen. It's like a
Pretty
super
awful.
scary condition and it's very bad for babies. So they set the level at 10 based on like science from the 1960s. But then now in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot more research showing different health effects like cancer, like birth defects
Yeah.
and thyroid disease at levels much lower than 10. And so we
Okay.
chose 3 as the level to analyze data because there's a number of regulators, including the EPA, that say that, 3 milligrams per liter shows human caused nitrate contamination of water. So, like, it's not a natural source. It's definitely human once it hits 3.
Okay.
And 3
Okay.
is kind of the level that indicates that nitrate will go up over time. So if you hit 3, you're more likely to see even
Oh, I
greater
see.
levels in the future.
Have some places ever managed to go down like they had been high and then through changing things they get down?
Water treatment is what these water systems do
Yeah.
to reduce it like below 10 to keep it safe. But there's been pilot projects in smaller areas. Like, I can't remember if it's Iowa City or Cedar Rapids in Iowa, but the water utility there has worked with farmers to actually put conservation practices on their
Okay.
fields near where they get their source water to try to reduce
Okay.
nitrate that's getting into water.
Yeah. Okay. How costly is it to treat for nitrates?
It's expensive. So nitrate is tricky because you can only really remove it through reverse osmosis or ion exchange, which are like 2 water treatment processes. So it's expensive because you can't just use like carbon. So, a lot of contaminants like, PFAS, forever chemicals, you can remove through a carbon filter. Like, think about
Yeah.
what you have in a Brita filter. That's a
Yep.
carbon-based
Yep.
filter. But nitrate, you cannot. It has to be these 2 kind of expensive processes. So, like in Des Moines, it costs over $10,000 a day for them to run their nitrate treatment system.
Okay. So it can
Pretty
be
pricey.
costly. Yep. Yep. Gotcha. Okay. The other thing that I'd like to understand is the sort of 10 we know is bad. Like bad. And 3 that we know that there is human activity that's increasing nitrates, and it's sort of related to sort of an upward trend once you reach that level. But would a nitrate level of 6 be twice as bad as a nitrate level of 3, or should we think about that differently?
I think it's we don't know. I will say that.
Okay.
The research is still emerging, but there is research showing cancer cases like at 3 and then different types of cancer at 5. So we do see health risks kind of along the spectrum of levels. So
Okay.
not me, but other people at EWG, some of our toxicologists did a peer reviewed journal article a few years ago that
Yeah.
found that 0.14 milligrams per liter of nitrate in water is like the 1 in a million colorectal cancer risk. So if you were able to treat down to 0.14, that's only going to cause one case of
Okay.
colorectal cancer in a
Okay.
million people.
Okay. All right. And I know I just one thing I'm wondering about in sort of, any body of research you have varying it's hard to make causal claims. Like it's what a lot of economists today spend a lot of their time. How credible can we be? And you kind of always end up doing the best with what you have. And so I'm curious in this literature, like what do the most conclusive studies say? What's the best evidence right now?
Yeah, so the best evidence really ties nitrate to colorectal cancer and then bladder cancer. So there's a lot of studies established showing those are tied, nitrate consumption specifically
Okay.
in drinking water to those
Okay.
types of cancer. There's a lot of other
Okay.
cancers where there's like emerging research,
Okay.
but those two are kind of like the big ones that have really good
Okay.
research. And the birth
And are
defects
they
research is good
okay.
as well.
Yeah, that's a good so are they able to separate places that have more nitrates from places like I think like rural areas of
Yeah.
people or say other environmental factors or income factors that might affect cancer?
Yeah, they have. There's some really good studies out of Iowa that use long data. So they tracked women, a group of women in Iowa for, over a decade, like back in the 80s and 90s, and were able to track closely, the increases in different health issues with nitrate consumption.
And are particular groups or ages more affected?
Not that we have seen in the literature yet. So, of course,
Okay.
babies when it comes to the birth defects and, like preterm birth, but there hasn't been a lot of research looking at if this is, affecting younger people or if it's affecting older folks on the cancer side.
All right. And so you said 62 million. Is it households or individuals?
So 62.1 million people, that's the number of people that
People.
are served by these
Okay.
over 6,000 community water systems that tested at or above 3 milligrams per liter for nitrate.
Is there a particular geographic concentration?
Yeah, we have a map with our report, an interactive map that shows all 6,114 systems.
Okay.
And of course, we see a lot of the issue being in agriculture heavy states,
Yeah.
California, Texas, here in the
Okay.
Midwest, the
Okay.
Northeast, kind of the places where you see a lot of row crop agriculture and animal agriculture is where you're
Okay.
seeing these nitrate levels.
Okay. Are there any other major causes that you industry or I don't know.
So wastewater from people can be a source as well. But I will say, here in Minnesota, the state has found that like 70% of nitrogen, I think it's over 70% of nitrogen in surface water is coming from farms. And the Iowa
Okay.
Nutrient Reduction Strategy says that over 90% of the nitrogen
Yeah.
in their water is coming from non-point sources, which we all know means farms in Iowa because there's not that many
Yeah.
point sources,
Yep.
a few
Yep.
wastewater treatment plants. So in ag
Okay.
states, we know
Okay.
it's really mostly coming from
Okay.
farm.
Okay, gotcha. And so in terms of mitigating this, if I were to look at it from a very narrow, cold-hearted economist perspective, cost benefit, you can pay to treat the water or you could try to change practices. Have
Mhm.
you looked at that kind of trade? And I know it's very narrow and doesn't count for everything, but have you looked at it from just that narrow perspective?
So what we think is that the EPA needs to do that, right? That's
Okay.
how they create these drinking water standards is they do a cost benefit
Okay.
analysis before they
Okay.
create like the 10 milligrams per liter level. That has not been updated in decades. So
Okay.
we think now that there's newer studies, they should be doing this cost benefit analysis so they can look at the cost of medical costs for
Yep.
cancers tied
Yep.
to nitrate
Okay.
and then compare that to the
Yeah.
cost
Yeah.
of treatment or of doing conservation practices on
Okay.
farm fields to reduce this. So we
Okay.
agree it should be done, but like that's the EPA's job, really.
Okay, gotcha. That's their mandate. Okay, so we know that there's relatively high concerning nitrate levels. What 62% is what percent of
So the 62 million is
people?
like almost 1 in 5
One
Americans.
in five Americans have elevated nitrate in their drinking water, which is concerning for public health, and it tends to be in rural areas. Is that
So there
is that correct?
it's in rural areas, but we found elevated levels even in cities because of how
Okay.
watersheds work. You don't
Okay.
have to
Yeah.
live right next to a farm to have nitrate in
Okay.
your water because it can come from upstream where there's farms. It can get into, aquifers for
Yeah.
groundwater that are really big, might be, stretching under farms.
Okay.
So it's in rural areas and cities as well.
Okay. And some cities are treating for this, or some municipalities treat for it, and so you wouldn't see as high of
Yeah.
levels.
Yeah, so, like, Des Moines is on this list of systems that tested at or above 3, but it wasn't on this list that tested at or above 10 because they
Okay.
treat to make sure it's never above
Okay.
the MCL.
Okay. Okay, gotcha. And it sounds like there's still things that we don't know. Like, we don't know a lot about doses. Is 6 twice as bad as 3? We don't know who's affected that most, and there hasn't really been even a narrow cost benefit, let alone a sort of cost more comprehensive one that looks at health outcomes and cost of mitigation.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
There have been some really interesting costs studies on, the medical cost sides.
Yeah.
Dr. Bonnie Keeler here in Minnesota just released an analysis in 2025 looking at the costs to medical, issues like colon cancer and also the cost of, reduction in quality of life just in Minnesota. And it's over $700 million a year that nitrate in drinking water is costing on the medical side, as well as the quality of life side. So there's some um, good studies around that, but not like a comprehensive cost benefit analysis that I've seen.
So if somebody lives in one of these places with elevated nitrate, if you buy a Brita filter or the equivalent of that, sure, is that enough?
It is not enough. The biggest concern if you're living in like a really affected area is if you're on a private well, because those aren't regulated by the EPA at all.
Yeah.
So for
Yeah.
that, it's like you definitely want to get your well tested for nitrate. And if there's high levels, you could do an under the sink reverse osmosis water
Okay.
treatment system. That probably would cost you like $200 to buy, and then you have to, replace the filters every 6 months.
Okay.
And $200 is in like Minnesota Menards dollars. That's how much it would
Okay.
cost if you get it at
Yep.
Menards. If it's from
Yep. Yeah.
Culligan or someone else, it would be more very
Okay.
likely. But people who are
Okay.
on public water, they can go on EWG's tap water database and look at their nitrate
Okay.
levels and see, if they're really
Okay.
high, the water treatments situation would be the same. You could do an under the sink reverse osmosis. But we also don't think, people on water systems that are already treating water should have to do more water treatment in their home. This should be something that water systems can remove
Yeah.
from drinking water.
And what do you recommend for parents?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I personally have a reverse osmosis system under our kitchen tap. If you are planning on having a baby and nitrate is a worry, if you're finding that it's high levels of nitrate in your water, then I would, recommend that.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there any way you could contextualize, give some context for the risk? Like 10 mil blue baby, we know
Yeah.
that's scary, right?
Yeah.
If it's 3 or 4 or 5, like, what is
Yeah.
that
Less
risk
scary.
comparable to? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, the lower levels are less scary. And the studies that show cancer risk at lower levels, that's been shown to be consumption over time. So if you drink it once, at 3 milligrams per
Yeah.
liter, it's not causing cancer. This is
Yeah.
a over time issue at the lower levels. I think the more acute issue I would be worried about as a mom is, the birth defect side. So if you are planning on having a baby and you find even, levels around 5 at or above 5, that might be something that you would want to, get the reverse osmosis system under your sink.
That's pretty helpful. All right. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about with this project or another project you're working on?
Just, something that we always talk about when we talk about nitrate is like conservation practices can really help. So, putting cover crops on a farm, we know that keeps soil in place, that keeps water in place. We're going to see less nitrate in drinking water. Buffer strips between farm fields and streams, also helpful. They're, obviously on the tillage side, less tillage means less soil, less water running off a field. So, we talk a lot about how, our federal conservation programs could kind of be reworked to prioritize some of these conservation practices that are better for reducing, water running off fields, getting through, nitrate through tile drains. And so I know this is part of the conservation series, so I want to
Yeah.
mention
Yeah. Yeah. And we've talked about
conservation
those
for
things a
sure.
lot. Yeah.
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 So it's like
Absolutely.
this is a really good example of something that conservation can really help fix. And it would be great if we could send more of this federal money to those types of
Yeah.
practices.
Well, there's a queue at NRCS. I mean, people are in line to get support to transition or continue doing these practices. All right. Well, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Ask some bigger picture policy questions. First of all, with the work you do, could you give me an example? We're going to start with pessimistic. What's one thing you're pessimistic right now, and one thing you're optimistic about?
I mean, I would say pessimistic federal policy, optimistic state policy, which is like a really broad. But on the farm side, what we've just seen last year with the OBBBA and then now with the House Farm Bill just passing, what's in those bills is not great on the environmental public health side. Like the House Farm Bill that just passed effectively cuts the Environmental Quality Incentives Program funding by $1 billion over 10 years. So that is definitely not something that is good for farmers or good for, the environment, public health.
Yeah.
But then on the state policy side, I feel like states are stepping up on a lot of this in order to, I don't know, make up for what's not happening on the federal policy side, or just because they're taking the lead on some of this. So like a good example is here in Minnesota. This is more not like the legislature, but in Minnesota, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is currently updating their CAPO permitting process. So this is the first time they've done it in over 20 years. They're looking into if the permitting process should be strengthened to try to help some of these, nitrate and other pollution issues in water from animal feeding operations. And then the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is considering revising our groundwater protection rule as well to see if that needs to be stronger. So they just had a comment period in March where people could submit comments talking about this groundwater protection rule, which also is focused on the nitrate side. So I think, I'm optimistic about states trying to step up and kind of work on some of these farm and food system issues because the federal policy side is just not great.
Yeah. There's definitely local impacts, so that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
for sure.
All right. Another question I like to ask, is there something that you feel like is misunderstood about the work that you do?
I mean, I would say there's a lot of things that is misunderstood.
You could say a couple if you want.
Yeah.
We're not that strict here.
I think some people think that we're anti-farmer, but we're really pro-farmer. What we have a problem with are like the systemic issues that essentially force farmers to farm in certain ways so that they can, make money, stay in business. Because we know, the government policies and, how ag corporations work, that really makes it so that it's hard for farmers to farm how they'd like. Farmers have to grow certain crops, use specific inputs that have these environmental issues and public health issues because that's the only way to make money. So, we are definitely not anti-farmer. We're really anti-systemic problems that make farmers have to do these things that, they don't always want to do. I think a good example always is like when a farmer wants to grow a different crop, a diversified crop, not just corn and soybeans here in the Midwest, they can't get a crop insurance policy if it's never been grown in the county before.
Yeah.
So the policies are set up to make it harder for farmers to try something new that could be beneficial for the environment or, people.
Yeah.
And then it's the same way with markets. There's a lot of people who want to grow oats here in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And there's not a buyer, Cargill, General Mills, Kellogg, they're not buying American oats. So the system is the issue here, and it's not farmers.
I have heard actually from my family who does cover crops that they wish there was a bigger market for a third crop to have
Yeah,
in the rotation, like a small grain. So that
definitely.
makes a lot of sense. So you also, I'm going to crop insurance nerd out a little bit here. You could get whole farm revenue protection.
I know,
Little
but
bit complicated, but you
it's
could do it.
but the paperwork, it's like the paperwork
I
of whole
know.
farm revenue is hard and it's subsidized much lower than, corn and soybeans, main
I
commodities.
think it's actually closer now.
There were, after
They've
OBBBA,
increased it. The issue is if you don't, crop insurance, you need data. If you don't have data, it's going to, even though it's highly subsidized, it's going to be rated as higher risk until you get
yeah,
more data. So,
for sure.
it, it,
So
any-
which I get it from an actuarial standpoint, but like it is
yeah.
for sure actively keeping farmers from trying new things. That's like,
New crops are harder to insure.
yeah.
All right. So, last question. You get to change one policy.
So
What would you change?
this is like maybe too specific, but the policy that frustrates me more than anything is the 50% EQIP mandate, that 50% of funding has to go to livestock farmers. I just think that, there are so many really beneficial conservation practices in EQIP that get almost no funding. And, I think those practices would really get a lot more funding and farmers would be able to try newer things if we weren't sending 50% of funding to, livestock farmers. So,
Yeah.
I'm a data nerd. I
Yeah.
follow the EQIP data. We have our conservation database, which has EQIP and CSP data. And so if you look at like the 2025 data, things like contour farming, farmers got $1,200 in 2025 nationally for contour farming. Filter strips, which is really great, something they talk about in Iowa, something they talk about all throughout the Midwest. That was $60,000 only across the country in 2025. And then you compare that to fencing, which was the third highest EQIP practice, which got over $94 million. Or, animal waste storage facilities was the 9th highest paid practice in 2025. That got over $57 million. So it's like, I do think if we didn't have this 50% livestock mandate and EQIP, we would be sending, more money to some of these practices that are just not getting a lot of funding.
That
And
is a
NRCS would
policy
have
detail I'm
time.
embarrassed to say I wasn't aware of.
And that's why I'm like, it might be too
Yes.
obscure, but it's something
No,
I think
I love
about
it.
a
I love
lot.
it. I like the specificity. So
Because I could say big picture stuff, but I'm like, for one policy that I really think would make like a big environmental impact and to farmers, because I think they would like to do more of this. We know these programs are always oversubscribed and there's never enough money. So I think changing that 50% mandate would have a big impact.
All right. I think this was a great conversation. I learned about some new things, so I appreciate that. I also appreciate the opportunity to hear more about your perspective and EWG's perspective. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss or bring up?
I don't think so, but thanks for having me on. And it was so nice to
Thanks for
get to
doing
talk
this.
about this work.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate it. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on Smoke and Mirrors.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining this episode of Smoke and Mirrors as we dig into the policies driving food and agriculture today and in the future.